Were you aware that sickle cell is actually protective? Because that was definitely not the impression I had. But it turns out sickle cell is one of the clearest examples of how a gene can save lives and cause suffering at the same time. The same genetic mechanism that protected people from death is also what causes devastating disease in some people. Quick pause. If this is your first time seeing me, hi, I'm Nicole. I talk a lot about genetics, ancestry, and the patterns history leaves in our bodies. Since it's Black History Month, I wanted to talk about this specifically because sickle cell disproportionately affects Black communities in the US, and that traces back to ancestry from the regions where malaria shaped human survival. So here's what actually is going on with sickle cell. You may remember this from biology class. Red blood cells are supposed to be soft and flexible like this. They need to squeeze through really tiny blood vessels to deliver oxygen everywhere in the body. With sickle cell, some of those cells lose that flexibility and then they start to siphon and curve. And once that happens, they don't move the way they're supposed to. They look like this. And they can block blood vessels, which is where the pain and damage come from. Now, here's where the inheritance part matters. Everyone gets 2 copies of a hemoglobin gene, one from each parent. If you inherit one sickle cell copy, most people don't have the disease. That's called sickle cell trait. And this is the part that I find so fascinating. If you inherit a single copy, it actually helped people survive from malaria. I mean, technically it still does. So here's what's super interesting. Malaria infects red blood cells, right? So when someone has one sickle cell copy, those cells are just different enough that the malaria parasite has a harder time surviving inside them. So the body clears those infected cells faster, which makes the infection much less likely to become deadly. That's the protection part, which is just so cool. That survival advantage is why this gene didn't disappear in places where malaria was common. But if you inherit 2 sickle cell copies, that's when it becomes sickle cell disease. That same change in red blood cell shape and hardness happens much more often. So oxygen doesn't move the way it should. Blood flow gets blocked, and that's when the condition becomes extremely painful and dangerous. I just find it fascinating that 1 copy of the gene helps people survive, and 2 copies is what causes the disease. We've already talked about the fact that sickle cell disproportionately affects the Black population in the United States, but where do their ancestors typically come from? Sickle cell is common in people whose ancestry traces back to regions where malaria shaped survival, especially parts of Africa, which we've already discussed, but also the Mediterranean, Middle East, and South Asia. And that's why sickle cell matters to talk about during Black History Month. It's a real example of how survival, ancestry, and inheritance all shape what shows up in people's bodies today. The same genetic change that helped people survive malaria is still being passed down. And depending on how it's inherited, it can protect or it can cause real harm. And if this kind of thing is interesting to you, genetics, ancestry, how history shows up in our bodies, I'd love for you to stick around. Give me a follow.